What I've been noticing here around Bexar County, and it's been going on for a long time, that our pastures really as a whole are overgrazed. We've been in a severe drought for a couple of years now, and what little rainfall we've been receiving really hasn't been enough to do us a whole lot of good. Producers that have cattle still, a lot of those cows are still in really poor body condition. They're relying a lot on purchased feed. And I'm also seeing that a lot of producers really don't have a good handle on what they're spending, what it's costing them. I think one of the challenges a lot of folks are dealing with is they feel like the more cows that they have on a piece of property, the more money they're going to make, which maybe necessarily always isn't the case. And the other challenge that many of them have, and it's unfortunate, but many of them think they need to continue to keep cows on their property for tax purposes. So our purpose of this result demonstration was really to look at grazing management, animal health, and just overall productivity and see how that affects economic return. And so we looked at two operations. One of them we'll refer to as the forage ranch, one we'll refer to as the feeding ranch. The forage ranch in essence had a much more conservative stocking rate. Their pastures were in better shape, and they actually had a significantly lower feed bill. And then we looked at the feeding ranch, which on the contrary, they had about double the stocking rate that the forage ranch had. They relied significantly more on purchased feed, and they had very minimal animal health program.
We ranch in Caldwell County in Lockhart, Texas. My mom and dad purchased that ranch 61 years ago, and they've been ranching on with a cow-calf operation ever since. When my dad passed away, it'll be 7 years this February that I took over, but the study was done about 5.5 years after he passed away. And as Sam had said earlier, the pastures were overgrazed, they were overstocked, brush was starting to encroach in, and weeds were starting to encroach in. And so we saw range conditions going down, and we saw cattle conditions going down, weaning weights going down from what little records we had that had been kept. And when I took over, I basically sat down with my mom and just said, Mom, we cannot continue to operate this way, losing this kind of money. It's just not feasible. So many of these people at ranch, it's their second job. I mean, they have a job, so it's a hobby. But I always say, when a hobby loses so much money and you keep doing it, that becomes an addiction. And do you want to keep with the addiction, or do you want to try to get out of the addiction? And I decided we had to get out of the addiction and do something different. When these ranches were purchased, my dad and his best friend that worked in the DPS together could not afford the entire 550-acre ranch. So they decided to go together and basically split the ranch and each one buy half of it because they could afford that. And so basically each ranch is around 275 acres. We looked on our ranch and we helped the feeding ranch and basically took out brush, pens, houses, hay traps, and said about 240 grazable acres. On the ranch, they actually sprigged the coastal at the same time to save cost. And so when they sprigged, the feeding ranch put out 100 acres of coastal, and my dad put out 50 acres of coastal and 50 acres of cline to just kind of diversify the grazing. And so all of that was done at the same time. My dad decided he needed to pay for the ranch, and the way to pay for the ranch in his mind was to have more cows. And so he stocked at 90 head on that, and he thought the more cows he had, the more calves he had, the more calves he could sell, the better he could pay the land payment back. The other gentleman thought around 60 was about right, and so he put 60 in, thinking that number was better for the overall ranch. So it actually started out where our ranch was more of the feeding ranch, and theirs was a little more of the forage ranch. When I took over, we had over 90 cows of basically a grade Brangus, I call them. They were Brangus influenced cattle. They were not registered Brangus. They were Brangus influenced cattle with Angus bulls on them. And that's a 1 to 3 stocking rate, which in my opinion was just not feasible and not sustainable. And the pasture showed it. I visited with my mom, who owns the ranch, and I convinced her to go down to 30 cows, which is a 1 to 8 stocking rate. And using the data, we thought we could go a little higher than that, but we cut it down to about 80%. We're dealing with damaged range that has been overgrazed for 50 plus years. And so we wanted to be kind of on the conservative side. Most of our cows are weighing probably around 1,300 pounds. I think most producers underestimate the size of their cattle. They think they weigh 1,000, 11. We weighed a few of ours that we culled, and they were weighing around 1,300 pounds. We had no production records. My dad was one of these that just ran the cows out there and gathered the calves. So we had to do all our selection on basically phenotype. We looked at structure, disposition, udder, those types of things that had to do our selection on because we had no records to look at. The feeding ranch sold their beef masters and said, hey, can we buy some of your cows? We like the Brangus cross. Well, we were more than happy to sell them to them. And it made it nice for this little demonstration we did because you can't take genetics into the deal. They're same genetics. When they made their stocking, they did not look at themselves as a feeding ranch. They looked at themselves as, we think this is about the right stocking rate, and then we'll just supplement what we need to. And I think a lot of producers do that where they really don't know what the correct stocking rate is.
I guess what's interesting to note as well is that on Dennis's property on the Forge Ranch, they just had one bull with their 30 cows. That was an Angus, registered Angus bull. And his neighbor ran 2 Simmental cross bulls for the 60 head that they had. Neither operation really ever pulled the bulls from the cows. They just ran the bulls with them year round. And the main reason for that was because they just didn't have a place to keep the bulls separated from the regular cow herd. Just want to mention that many times, as many of you probably are already aware, management practice on a property can influence how much grass or how much forage you can grow, but in the example, the general land management applications were in essence the same.
When we started land management practices and I took over, we're good friends with the landowner that we're working with, and they don't have a lot of equipment. We have a boom sprayer and those types of things. So we made a deal with them where when we were spraying, he figured that was kind of the right time he thought it should be sprayed. Would we mind spraying his place? So we put the fertilizer out at the same time when I'm putting the fertilizer out, and we put the weed spray out at the same time. The feeding ranch wanted some help with his cattle. They do have a gentleman that helps on the ranch, but they needed some help on just keeping records and tagging some cattle. Again, I told you, none of these cattle were identified. So on both ranches, cows were tagged, and calves are now tagged within the first week of their life, so we can match the cow to the calf. We keep some basic information that we put on a spreadsheet, and I keep some basic information on his and use the same spreadsheet. And the way we do that is so that I also know when these cattle were born, because we haul all the calves to the auction barn. We typically wean around 7 months of age, and by knowing the ages on ours and then knowing the ages on his, we can help correlate the marketing of these to where they're marketed at the right time, not just whenever we feel like they're ready. When we started designing the supplementation program, we decided what we were going to use. We went to the 26% Q because at that time of the study, they were $11.85 a bag, which came out to 91 cents per pound of protein. The 20% cube came out to $1.05 per pound of protein. So it's a no-brainer, use the 26% cube. It's a better deal. And a lot of producers just look at the price of the bags of cubes and go, well, that one's cheaper. It's the price per pound of protein that makes the difference. And then we test all of our hay. That hay for this study was 11% crude protein and 60% TDN. And we core sample all of our hay. If I get, say, 50 bales, I'm going to core sample 30 of them, mix it up, send it to the lab, and find out, because if you don't have your hay sampled, you're just guessing at what your supplement program should be. Our hay checked out at $1.14 per pound of protein. I want to feed as little hay as possible because it is the most expensive per pound of protein of any of the feeds out there. So I want to feed as little possible, utilize that standing forage as much as possible. And then the final thing we do is we keep a mineral tub out year round. The other ranch does not put out mineral. They eat about 4 ounces a day. It comes out to about $1,500 annually, which is $48 a head, which sounds like a lot, but mineral programs are so important on reproductive issues and that type of thing.
The notable difference between the forage ranch and the feeding ranch was really two-faceted. Number one was the amount of time that they were feeding, and two, the volume of which they were feeding. When you think about the range cubes, the forage ranch fed 1 to no more than 2 pounds per head per day for about 110 days, while the neighbor fed anywhere between 5 and 6 pounds of range cubes per head per day for 125, 130 days. Forage ranch typically fed anywhere from 10 to 15 pounds of hay per head per day for about 90 days. whereas his neighbor was feeding 30 to 40 pounds per head per day for anywhere from 150 to 180 days. As you kind of think about this, the forage ranch would be feeding in essence about 1.5 bales per cow per year, whereas the feeding ranch would be 4.5 bales of hay per cow per year. If you kind of put some numbers to that, you would estimate that the feeding ranch is in essence got about another $400 per head annually in terms of just hay cost alone.
One thing I felt like that was very important when we took over the ranch was to have a good herd health program. I encourage all producers to get with their vets and organize a good herd health program. I remember during one time on the ranch, we lost 6 head calves due to blackleg because my dad had no vaccination program, and those calves were valued at that point at $1,000 a head. So that's $6,000 we lost. We're going to show you the numbers in a minute, but we estimated that would pay between 8 to 10 years of the entire herd health program just off those calves we lost on that one outbreak. So that's why herd health program is so important. We work our cows twice a year. We usually work in the spring and the fall. In the spring, we vaccinate with an 8-way. I don't care what product you use. We've just been using an UltraBac 8. And then we use a respiratory product. We use the Virus Shield 6 plus VL5HB. We definitely want to make sure that there's lepto in your vaccine, because if you have wild hogs, which most people do, and if they share a water source with the cattle, you can have a lepto outbreak. And if you have a leptospirosis outbreak, you're going to have a very poor reproduction that year. So we do vaccinate with that. We deworm in the spring, and then we will put insecticide ear tags in, and we do rotate those with different chemistries. We then come back in the fall. We cut the ear tags out. We vaccinate again with an 8-way, like UltraBac 8, and again a respiratory product. We also put a pour on for lice control. Our health cost came to about $28 a cow, which is about $875 to $900 a year. That did include a breed soundness exam on the bull. Now our calves, a lot of producers will say you don't need to do any work to the calves until after they're weaned. We've shown with that death loss that's not the case. Our bull calves, when they're tagged that first week of life, we band them and we give them a tetanus shot. We come back about 3 weeks later and give them a second tetanus shot. Our calves are all worked at 3 months of age. We give them an 8-way, the Virus Shield, which is a respiratory. We deworm them. We come back a month later, which is the most important part of it. The booster, they've shown that the first vaccine gives about a 10% control. The second one, the booster, jumps it up to about 90 to 95% control. We come back 30 days, we give them a second 8-way and a respiratory. We also use a Synovex C implant in both heifers and steer calves because of the extra weight gain. That comes out to about $500 a year or so, about $17 a calf.
During this project, Dennis's neighbor really wasn't doing any kind of herd health program on his mature cow herd. What he was doing for the bull and heifer calves was he was giving them 1 shot of a blackleg 8-way. He was using 1 injection of UltraBac 8. Unfortunately, though, he wasn't given a booster, so the efficacy of that initial shot was pretty minimal. Additionally, his neighbor didn't castrate any of the bull calves, didn't implant any of those calves either. So they had a pretty minimal health program, which equated to about $1 per head or $49 annually. The total economic breakdown between the two operations was really interesting. Dennis had 30 cows, and in 2023 he marketed 30 calves, which is outstanding. 100% calf crop. That doesn't always happen annually, but very thankful for when it does. His steers and heifers averaged 590 pounds, and they typically try to wean at about 7 months of age, but due to the drought, he did end up weaning a few calves a little bit earlier than 7 months of age. I would say that although a 590 pound weaning weight is certainly acceptable, and it sounds good that in a normal year where you might receive 30 to 35 inches annual rainfall, the likelihood is that weaning weight would have been quite a bit higher than 590 pounds. So overall, he produced 17,700 pounds of beef on 240 grazable acres, which equivalates to 74 pounds of beef per acre. His neighbor, on the other hand, had 60 cows, so he had to double the stocking rate at a cow to 4 acres. He had an 82% calf crop and was able to market 49 calves in 2023. And you may ask, well, my goodness, why did he only have an 82% calf crop? The reality there is that his cows were in a little poor body condition. And so the likelihood is that a lot of those cows weren't able to breed back, 3 months into lactation. So as a result, they're not going to calve in a 12-month calendar year. So a lot of those cows didn't calve until perhaps 14, 16, 18 months later. And so in essence, he didn't have a marketable calf to sell in that calendar year. His weaning weights on those calves were about 400 pounds on average, just shy of 200 pounds lighter than the calves that were marketed off of the forage ranch. The feeding ranch ended up producing 19,600 pounds of beef on 240 acres, or 81 pounds of beef per acre. If you look at that math, it's interesting to note that actually the feeding ranch produced about 2,000 pounds more than what the forage ranch marketed, but that's not really quite the end of the story. The 30 calves that Dennis sold on the forage ranch, those calves brought $2.19 a pound, returning about $1,293 per head. And that equivalates to a total of just shy of $39,000. His cow cost, so just to keep the cow around, was a little over $1,000. And that included things like his feed cost, which was obviously the biggest one, health expenses, insurance, taxes, depreciation, those types of things is kind of what calculates into that annual cost to keep the cow around. So in all, he made $7,890 that year off of his cattle operation. His neighbor, on the other hand, sold 49 calves. They actually brought more per pound. They sold for $2.50 a pound. Part of the reason was because they were quite a bit lighter, and so those lighter weight calves are going to typically bring a little bit more per pound. And his neighbor received about $1,000 per head, so his total income on 49 marketable calves equivalated to $49,000. His cow costs were just slightly higher, about $70 higher than Dennis's cow cost at $1,100 per head, but he had more of them, right? Dennis had 30 cows, his neighbor had 60. So when you add up his total expenses and you look at what he brought in income-wise and what his expenses were, his neighbor actually lost $17,600 that year on his operation.
One thing I've got to say is you've got to keep records. We had a theory, and the theory was we could run less cows, make more money, and keep our range condition sustainable, where it wasn't just grazed to the dirt all the time. But without records, you just don't know that. But what we found is by our records, we did find that we actually made more money off really 2/3 less cattle. Our range condition went up substantially, and we were able to feed those cows less. Body condition scores went up. When we started the demonstration, the body condition scores on our cows were in 3s, and they're now in the 5s, even up to 6. And by feeding less and by having more forage out there, we can cut back on the amount of hay that we feed, which is expensive, and better utilize our pastures. But at the same time, those pastures are sustainable, that when we get a rainfall, they respond to it because there's a grass cover out there and we're not getting a bunch of weeds growing after we get a 2-inch rain. And what I've learned is this, and we always stress this to everybody we ever talk to. Everybody are forage growers. You grow forage and then you decide how to utilize that forage. And we decided to use beef cattle. Some people may use hay, some people may use goats, whatever. We decided we're going to grow forage and we're going to use cattle to harvest that forage, and I want to use as much of that forage as efficiently as I can to keep my feeding costs down and keep my pastures sustainable.
Dennis's neighbor took a look at the records that Dennis had over in 23 at the end of the year, and kind of had a couple of ideas of what he wanted to do moving forward. And one of the things he thought about doing initially was, he said, well, I'm going to just go ahead and reduce my numbers from 60 head of cows to 40 head of cows, and I'm going to implement a health program. Then I think after he kind of really evaluated and thought about it a little bit more, he realized that it took Dennis a little over 5 years to make the progress that he had made from starting with a pasture that was really overgrazed, significantly overgrazed, to where he is now with his cows in much better body condition and his forage situation much better. And as a result of thinking about that, his neighbors kind of decided that, look, I don't know that I want to wait 6-7 years for my pastures to be able to recover. I think the best thing for me maybe to do would just be to completely destock. And so that's what he's elected to do. He has sold all of his cows. He worked with his local chief appraiser, which is really important, and in visiting with him was going to have no penalties by destocking, and his chief appraiser said you can have 2 years to remove the cows and let your pastures have a chance to recover. And so that's in essence what he's elected to do. He's indicated that when he does get ready to restock and he does want to get back in the cattle business, that he will be implementing a herd health program, and he's also going to reduce his stocking rate.
Okay, we've thrown a lot at you information-wise on this video, but the main thing to remember, my main goal when my father passed away and I took over the ranch was to improve cattle production, to improve individual animal performance, but at the same time, improve pasture production and pasture quality. And we've come a long way, and I think my father would be proud of what we've done so far. I know my mom really enjoys the ranch, really likes the financial aspect of how it's doing, but we still got a long way to go. And my ultimate goal is to make this ranch sustainable and profitable so that future generations can afford to run the ranch but enjoy it at the same time.